Great, thank you everyone. Thank you very much to the organizers and to all of my fellow speakers. I've learned so much from all of you. So thank you so much for all of your wonderful presentations. It's my pleasure to be here today. When we as scholars study figurines of humans, we often want to be able to give that tiny person a name, to securely identify them, and perhaps to link them to a textual tradition. As scholars, it is very appealing to be able to interpret symbols clearly with the function of the object, even if it is a non-utilitarian ritual function, to be plainly elucidated. The application of labels, such as calling a figurine like this Heracles, or this one Heracles, or this one Heracles, putting names to objects that are not inscribed with names, but we're just interpreting that from what they look like, takes us in this case into the specific realm of Greek mythological tradition, in which the club and pelt become unambiguous visual evocations of the Nemean lion hunt story, and the figurine itself interpreted from the lens of deity worship. However, when we do this, we sometimes forget that people in the ancient world were not art historians, and maybe didn't always care what this figurine was supposed to be. This is particularly a possibility when the figurines are made at a different point in time, or thousands of miles away, or in a different cultural context from the prototype. In Mesopotamia, for instance, a figure that represents a man who hunts lions could have other names and other mythological interpretations rather than just Heracles. The name, the label, might seem to help us illuminate some meanings of the figurine, but it also might be obscuring other meanings or other identities. And I know I don't need to tell any of you this, but it's the lens from which I'd like to look at today. So I am arguing that attempting to securely identify a figurine type can also fail to consider how things that seem like frustrating ambiguities where we can't put a name, and that honestly can be frustrating, annoying, irritating, right? We want to be able to label information about a figurine that is hard to categorize, hard to put a name to. This might actually have been intentional, and it might have been advantageous to the people who use these objects. So to briefly illustrate my point, I see here the example of figurines depicting nude women supporting their breasts. This motif had a long history in Mesopotamia, as you all know, as well as in other regions of the Near East and Mediterranean, and several of you have already talked about such figurines. Now, many of us, including myself, have argued about the meaning of figurines like this, which are sometimes called mother goddesses, particularly in older interpretations. But we still talk a lot about whether these held a fertility or a nurturing function, and Adi just did an amazing job of breaking down exactly what fertility means, and that it means a whole bunch of different things and a whole bunch of different points in time. So, talking about fertility with these figurines, focusing on the maternal aspects of breasts and nursing, or instead, focusing on a sexual function, focusing on the breast as an erogenous zone and the posture as one of erotic display. But I suggest that one possible reason that this debate has not really been solved is that it was not intended to be. That both interpretations were supposed to be possible, just as the female body itself and the breasts as part of the female body were and are multivalent, can be used for eroticism and can be used for fertility and maternity and nursing on the same body, on the same woman, on the same figurine. So for modern scholars, a text would be satisfying here, right? Putting a name, putting a label, putting some kind of secure identifier on this image to pin it down. Yet I think we seriously need to consider that the people who made and used these objects did not, in fact, want to pin them down. So in this paper, I will explore this idea of a functional, desirable ambiguity through the female figurines of Hellenistic Babylonia, particularly figurines depicting women holding or nursing infants. So Babylonia, which is in southern Mesopotamia in modern Iraq, became part of the Greek world after the conquest of Alexander the Great. It then became the heartland of the Seleucid kingdom for about 2 centuries, and the influence, and there's the box right there, is Babylonia, blown up with some of the major cities. And the influence of Greek art and Greek culture persisted in the region from the beginning of the Seleucid kingdom through the conquest of the Parthians in 141 BCE and later. Particularly in such a multicultural environment, it is difficult to place secure labels on iconography and to be certain that everyone who used a figurine agreed on what his or her name and identity was supposed to be. So in analyzing the Hellenistic Babylonian figurines of women holding babies, rather than attempt to identify these figurines by name or deduce a singular purpose for their imagery, I propose sort of flipping it around and investigating what these objects themselves can tell us, what their materiality, what their construction can tell us about what their users found most important about them, and particularly what these figurines can tell us about the role of women in Hellenistic Babylonia. So what do these figurines tell us as both objects and images? As objects, the material construction of the woman and child figurines means that these two figures, the woman and the baby, belong together. Of course, figurines depicting single figures by themselves could be grouped together in collections or dioramas, used and displayed as a cohort. But what differentiates those figurine assemblages from the group figurines is that these choices were temporary and could be changed. With the woman and child figurines, the user did not have a choice in what human bodies were brought together in a permanent relationship and how that relationship was displayed. The object, and through it, the society that produced it, and the social norms that condoned its use, imposed this particular vision of social structure on the user. The woman and the baby belong together. And there were only 3 permanent relationships where the object itself kind of glues these two people together. There were only 3 of these relationships in Hellenistic Babylonian figurines: the woman and child, the male-female couples, and the pairs of musicians. So it's not a lot of these connections that are made so fixed. It is perhaps not surprising that one of the few types of relationships depicted as a permanent relationship was that between an adult woman and a child, usually an infant. The connection between an infant and an adult, often female caregiver, is the first relationship that most people experience in their lives. It is also one of the most important, as the perpetuation of human society, indeed the survival of the human species, given how helpless our offspring are, is dependent on such acts of nurture and protection. Now, depictions of adult women with a child have a long history in the figurine traditions of the ancient world, as you all know. In Mesopotamia, figurines of women with children were already common by the 3rd millennium BCE. Hellenistic Babylonian figurines depicting women with children more immediately followed upon the intense popularity of the nursing mother motif in the Neo-Babylonian period. In their form and style, they were also in close dialogue with other woman and child chorotrophos figurines in the Hellenistic Koine, particularly figurines from Israel, Ptolemaic Egypt, and the Greek cities of southern Italy, as many of you know far better than I do. In utilizing this motif, the people of Hellenistic Babylonia demonstrated both their deep local roots in Mesopotamia, as well as their connections with the wider Hellenistic world. But beyond the basic parameters of a historically significant motif, the particulars of these figurines can shed more specific light on Hellenistic Babylonian society. The figurines were modeled with stable bases that facilitate an easy upright display, such as showing the woman seated on a throne or a chair. Standing women holding children could be shown on a plinth or a thick flared base. The ability of most of these figurines to stand alone without human assistance distance them from a potential user. You can put it on a shelf, you can look at it from across the room. And this is different from a lot of other Hellenistic Babylonian figurines, which require user handling. So there's an example there, and there's an example there. But the mother and child figurines do not need this. They do not need tactile contact to come alive. In fact, they do not ask for tactile contact at all. The babies in particular are very difficult to touch, but their bodies are often more implied than fully modeled in 3 dimensions. The women's bodies are more accessible, although their heavy drapery and often unmodeled backsides, despite the fact that they're made in a double mold, do not reward tactile exploration. Bulky when single molded and thick-walled when double molded, the technical construction of these figurines also favors the sturdy and the powerful, rather than the pleasantly tactile and portable. Such autonomous strength was not only distancing, it was also timeless, locating the women and children outside of the realm of normal concerns and quotidian worries, a temporal plane in which babies neither age nor die. Real infancy slips by in a matter of months. Squirmy toddlers quickly age out of being carried in the manner that the woman in this figurine supports the baby, cradled across her lap and tucked into the crook of her elbow. Some more examples here. You don't get many months of doing this. Alternately, and tragically common in the ancient world, babies die, even despite the best efforts of their caregivers. The moment depicted in the woman and child figurines is an enormously important and ever-present part of human life, but it is also a temporary and a fragile one. The power that such figurines offer to reduce the liminality of their relationship, to put it on a pedestal, to make it permanent, to make it strong. You don't have to touch it. It won't fall over. That's appealing, and it may help account for these figurines' widespread appeal. Desires for an artificial timeless permanency may also explain why the figurine hides the substantial responsibility and labor-intensive nature of parenting. In the figurines, we are not shown what you see here on the screen and what I feel honestly with my own kids every day. The woman who toils and feels drained by continual physical and emotional demands. That parenting and motherhood is a tremendous amount of work. But the figurines don't show us that. Rather, the figurines fix the woman's attention upon us, her admiring audience. Her head is raised, her gaze is directed away toward us rather than down at the child. Her right hand is guiding the breast to the infant's mouth as if by habit. The distracted breastfeeding of the female figure projects the easy accomplishment of a process that, while natural, is surprisingly difficult to master. Especially with an infant so young, effortless breastfeeding is uncommon, as both baby and mother must learn the technique, sometimes without success. The figurine woman's ability to nurse her infant while engaging with an audience exudes a proficiency and confidence that real women often only aspire to, sort of a role model here. This lactation and nursing competency was crucial to child survival in the ancient world, but due to high maternal mortality during childbirth, the difficulties some women experience with nursing or simple convenience, this nurturing act was not always provided by the biological mother. And as Adi already alluded to, right, we refer to these figurines as mothers. However, the assumption that the woman depicted was always interpreted by ancient viewers as the child's mother, that may or may not be the case. There is ambiguity in these images. Wet nurses were commonly employed in both Mesopotamian and Greek cultures and could be beloved by the children that they cared for. Greek vase painting and stele often depict younger women as slaves engaged in childcare, and it can be difficult to distinguish nurses from mothers in Greek representations of private life. Even the sometimes sumptuous depiction of clothing on the figurines do not necessarily offer clarification, as Mesopotamian records indicate that wet nurses were given allowances of clothing and in some cases very expensive gifts. The specifics of the woman's body might not even be meant as a direct reflection of the corporeal form of a maternal figure, but rather speak to the broader negotiation in Hellenistic Babylonia about preferred female body types, which tended toward a fairly narrow ideal of age and proportions. The contractual and legally regulated practices of wet nursing, as well as surrogacy, which was hired or enforced pregnancy and infant relinquishment, has important implications for the kinds of relationships that these woman and child figurines depicted. They not only portrayed a physical and emotional bond between two people, but also potentially revealed a network of social and economic connections. The pose of the figurine implies that the woman should not only accept, but actively receive and welcome the intrusion of spectators, viewers who may have been less interested in her and more interested in the services she could provide, seeing her body as a means toward a desirable end. So her body is what facilitates the child surviving. The miniaturization of the motif would have intensified, or rather compressed and concentrated, this effect. Miniaturization encourages the user to make a personal encounter with the object, allowing the person to take their object into his or her intimate space to see and touch the figurine from all angles. Making such an eager, outward-looking mother into a figurine, into a tiny version of herself, positioned her as a willing participant in the twice-over commodification of her body, which was depicted as a vehicle for infant sustenance that could be rented out or enslaved if necessary, and also literally ownable in miniature form that could be enclosed within the human hand. She was an ideal, but she was an ideal that seemed happy to consent to being possessed, to being understood, to being controlled, and to being enjoyed by others. Now, going from the bottom of the social hierarchy to the more elite end of the spectrum, there is the possibility that these figurines depict a maternal goddess. Indeed, the motif of the enthroned mother has strong parallels in representations of Isis suckling the god Horus, imagery that was widely popular throughout the Mediterranean in the Hellenistic period, as well as the later Virgin and Christ imagery that was derived from it. Venerated as sacred, yet these women were nevertheless celebrated primarily for what they could provide, and particularly for whom they could provide it. The Virgin is celebrated because she bears Christ. The suckling incarnation of Isis is a support for Horus, god of kingship. Mortal women could share in this imagery as well. Indeed, one of the earliest known examples of the motif is seen in the Old Kingdom Egyptian calcite figurine depicting Queen Ankh-Nesmerira holding her son, the child pharaoh Pepi II, across her lap in celebration of her care for him as both mother and regent. While these women may have been enthroned, it was so that their bodies could serve as an even more luxurious living throne for their children. As with all thrones, wooden or otherwise, their role thus becomes one of public presentation, displaying the enthroned child to the admiring gaze of spectators for the benefit of society at large. Hellenistic Babylonian figurines may directly depict such goddesses and thus might have functioned as devotional images. For instance, these figurines could potentially be identified as Isis with Harpocrates or Cybele with Attis, although the women lack a crown or other unambiguous goddess attributes in most cases. This was likely an advantage in the multicultural communities of Hellenistic Babylonia, in which individuals might have held multiple competing ideas of who a maternal goddess might be. One man's Isis is another man's Demeter. The iconography, such as the double bun hairstyle, also links these figurines to other goddesses, such as Aphrodite, who are not always particularly maternal. Additionally, such figurines may also have been plausibly identified as mortal women. The vast majority of such figurines, such as these examples, have no attributes or other indications of royal or divine status. When this maternal iconography of service was transferred out of any specific focus on powerful or divine women and applied to the depiction of perhaps more ordinary mothers or nurses, it elevated and idealized. An equivalency between mortal and divine, royal and commoner was drawn, offering the promise that the lowliest woman, perhaps even a slave, could achieve perfection through her devotion to a child. So deliberate ambiguity in the imagery might have been socially useful in these figurines, creating a peer pressure type encouragement and reward for attentive caregiving, rather than an impossible standard applicable to goddesses only. Indeed, I argue that this ambiguity was a primary purpose of the figurines. It allowed them to adapt to the needs of their users and be broadly appealing and useful socially. The intertwining of idealization with service also inflected the specific depiction of how the child was supported by the woman. In Hellenistic Babylonian figurines, there seems to have only been one correct way to carry a baby, on the left side of the woman's body. This rule follows upon a general trend for left side carrying in earlier Mesopotamian and Greek figurines. and it may also follow Mesopotamian conceptions of how gender roles map onto the human body. Indeed, I would suggest that it's possible that the woman's right arm is free because power and agency was particularly associated with the right side in images of Mesopotamian kingship and his powerful right arm. Another example here. The caregiving woman, although not a king, obviously was presumably also a protector for the infant, and some measure of power is necessary in that role. Conversely, Mesopotamian ideas of gender equated the left side of the body with the female, and women were said to wear their clothes on the left. Thus, the baby is nuzzled into the more feminine part of the woman's body and nurses from her more female left breast, while the woman's right arm is left free to be strong and powerful. In addition to these Mesopotamian specific meanings, which may or may not have been legible and meaningful to all members of Hellenistic Babylonian society, I additionally propose that the left side positioning of the child also reflected a psychological and neurological ideal of mothering behavior. Several recent psychological studies have revealed that most people, particularly women, naturally carry babies on the left side, regardless of whether they are right or left-handed. Theories regarding this preference suggest that the posture promotes infant development, particularly social and emotional skills, such as the ability to interpret facial expressions. So children who are held on the left side when they are babies show a normal ability on facial recognition tests, and babies that are usually held on the right side of their mother's body show a significantly decreased ability to recognize faces. So holding your baby on the left side is healthier for your baby. Additionally, women who routinely hold their babies on the right side of their bodies are more likely to be experiencing maternal stress and depression, factors which can also create a less than ideal environment for their offspring. Psychologically and neurologically, left side placement of a child is ideal for maternal health, for fetal development, and crucially, for enabling the child to develop successful relationships later in their life. Obviously, the Hellenistic Babylonian makers and users of women and child figurines had no access to psychological research of this sort. But the consistent positioning of the child on the left side of the woman's body may reflect the craft person's daily observation of mothers and caregivers in action. What is important here is that the art is not ambiguous on this point. There may be ambiguities of identity: mortal, divine, mother, wet nurse, slave. This ambiguity throws into sharp relief the aspects of the figurine that leave no room for doubt, no room for interpretation. The nurturing women depicted in the figurines, whoever they are required to serve as both a support and a conduit for the child's eventual social life. They must ideally position that child, giving him or her the best possible chance at a positive future. Figurines can be very, very clear on certain points, but they often point to different priorities than maybe what we are hoping for, which is a name for who this is. Also unambiguous was the fact that this kind of relationship was valued, to the virtual exclusion of almost all others. Many other potential relationships are missing from the Hellenistic Babylonian figurine corpus. There are no siblings, no fathers with children, no grandparents, no extended family, etc. Even older mothers with teenage or adult children are conspicuously absent, which is a notable disjuncture with the classical Greek tradition of Demeter and Persephone figurines. The reason for the lack of other family relationships in the Hellenistic Babylonian figurines is uncertain, but its effect is pretty straightforward. In Hellenistic Babylonia, the young woman holding an infant or toddler stands or sits alone, a solitary synecdoche of the entire family and the wealth of relationships it could contain. Mental return to this primal moment and formative relationship was enforced, an eternal back to the beginning that implied through its uniqueness that similar perfection could not be replicated later in life or with other relationships. The child will grow, must grow. The world must meet the baby and vice versa, but no future relationship could ever be as perfect or as pure. Thank you.